The restoration of ties between Iran and Saudi Arabia in a deal brokered by China reflects what some consider a changing world order. What can we expect for global diplomacy? Hello, I'm Arnold Naidu, and this is The Heat. Iran and Saudi Arabia agreed to resume diplomatic ties, and the effects are expected to be felt across the region. Until now, the two countries were bitter rivals. The deal also highlights China's growing role in international diplomacy. We begin with this report from Dongshu in Beijing.
Another historic moment has been made as Iran and Saudi Arabia agreed to restore diplomatic relations in a deal mediated by China, ending 7 years of estrangement and jolting the geopolitical alignment of the Middle East. During talks in Beijing on Friday, an agreement was signed by three sides to reopen embassies and representative offices within 2 months between Saudi Arabia and Iran. The three countries also vowed to strengthen regional peace and security. China's senior diplomat Wang Yi said improved relations between Saudi Arabia and Iran have opened the way to peace and stability in the Middle East region. China supports countries in the Middle East region to uphold strategic independence, strengthen solidarity and coordination, and truly hold the future and destiny in their own hands. Wang also said Beijing supports all developing countries to strengthen cooperation and to safeguard common interests, and will continue to call for a political settlement of disputes through dialogue in order to safeguard world peace and stability. Both Iran and Saudi Arabia praised China's role in bringing the two Middle East rivals to the table, as well as its efforts in promoting peace and stability in the region. For China, this is another example of what can be achieved under Chinese President Xi Jinping's Global Security Initiative. Dongshu, CGTN, Beijing.
There is a lot to discuss. Let's bring in our panelists. From Tehran, Akbar Dareini is a researcher and writer. Victor Gao is chair professor at Soochow University. He joins us from Beijing. And from the U.S. state of Virginia, Trita Parsi is the executive vice president of the Quincy Institute. Welcome to all of you. Trita Parsi, it wasn't that long ago when these two countries were fierce rivals, hurling insults at each other. In fact, Saudi Arabia blamed Iran for an attack on one of its oil installations. And of course, these two countries have been on opposite sides of that brutal civil war that's taking place in Yemen right now. So what's changed? What led them to decide to resume diplomatic relations?
Thank you for having me. Let me first start off by saying that they will remain fierce rivals. But what the normalization deal allows them to is to have a mechanism to be able to manage that rivalry so that it doesn't get out of hand. And that is precisely why I think they decided to go for it, because it has been very costly to Iran and it's been quite costly to the Saudis as well. So both of them have an interest in making sure that their rivalry does not lead to a situation that will be more detrimental to each other than it has been so far. Whatever they thought they could gain out of the way that they've been fighting each other for the last 7 years has come to an end, and they're open now to begin a new chapter. But I think we should have low expectations about what this will mean in practical terms in the sense of the Saudis and the Iranians moving towards some sort of an alliance or anything of that sort. That's very far away if it ever were to happen. But reducing their tensions, managing the rivalry, that's good news for the region as a whole.
When you say the region as a whole, Trita, what kind of impact would this have?
Well, first of all, in Yemen, as you mentioned, there's a reasonable hope there that this will help make sure that the existing truce that has expired, but it is still in place, can be made into a permanent agreement and hopefully end that civil war. I think it's important to recognize that the Yemeni civil war has its domestic roots, but unfortunately, both what the Saudis and the Iranians have done have further fueled that fight. If they reduce their involvement, if they pressure the two sides to end the fighting, that can be helpful, but it will not in and of itself be a solution. And then all the way to the other side of the Middle East in Lebanon, I think we can expect to see some positives of this rapprochement or this normalization take place there as well.
All right, joining us now from Riyadh in Saudi Arabia is Salman Al-Ansari. He is a political researcher. Salman, great to see you. We're talking about this deal that was signed between Iran and Saudi Arabia. What's the view from Riyadh? Why did Saudi Arabia think that it was the time right now to resume diplomatic relations with Iran?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I think, as you have said, it is considered to be like a big move in the Middle East. And to be honest, a lot of analysts haven't expected this to happen at this particular time. The Kingdom of Saudi Arabia has always been asking for dialogue and political solutions for the conflicts we have been seeing in the region. But as we all know, that Saudi Arabia was cornered and pushed and forced to cut ties with the Iranian regime back in 2016, when the Iranian regime stormed and burned the Saudi embassy in Tehran and also the Saudi consulate in Mashhad. So we will see right now. We can't actually anticipate that all the problems have been resolved, or no, it's just like a big first step, and we will see how things will unfold in the coming 2 months specifically, because right now we have seen how the Chinese government has been very serious in finding a way through which they can end the conflict in the Middle East, because that's going to be at the interest and for the interest for China. Since China is actually having big ambitions with regards to its Silk Road, the BRI, and it will go through Saudi Arabia, it will go through Iran. So you can't have such a big development plan without having to resolve all these big issues between the two big rivals.
Salman, Trita Parsi told us a moment ago that expectations are low. What are your expectations?
Yeah, I don't expect a lot, to be honest. Like, we've had a lot of agreements before, peace agreements and resuming relations with Iran before, etc. So we have kept seeing them to move away from their commitments. They were not up to the agreements that they have signed. So we have a trust kind of issue with the Iranian regime. But what is different right now is the fact that we have the Chinese government to be somehow as a guarantor of the relationship between Saudi Arabia and Iran. We will see how that goes, since we all know that the Iranian regime right now is in one of its worst times almost in history, speaking of economy, speaking of political situation, speaking of its own security. We've seen how some regional players are actually attacking the Iranian regime in Syria and in so many different regions without having Iran to respond. Why? Because they couldn't actually respond in any way whatsoever, because their situation is very dire. And also the protest within Iran has been going until now. And as we know, the Iranian regime or the Iranian population right now, we are speaking of more than 45% of the population in Iran are under the poverty line. So the kingdom would love actually to show to the Iranian that there is another path, which is the path of development, prosperity, a path for you to become a normal nation rather than a revolutionary one. And we only can hope that the Iranian regime will find consensus and find a way through which they can realize that their politics and their way of doing things hasn't worked, and it will never work.
Well, okay, let's get the view from Iran. We are joined by Ali Akbar Dareini. Ali Akbar, what do you make of what you've just heard? I mean, Iran is, of course, under very heavy sanctions right now. It's been isolated for a very long time. That nuclear deal that it initially signed appears to be frozen for the foreseeable future. But we did have a very senior official in the Iranian government, an advisor to the supreme leader, describe this agreement as, in his words, a political earthquake. So what's that looking like in Iran?
China's mediation between Iran and Saudi Arabia is way beyond an agreement on resumption of diplomatic relations between two regional rivals. This deal, to me, means America's influence on the global stage is shrinking and China's influence is growing. And this should be seen as a monumental development that brings a new era of geopolitics and a new strategic landscape in this part of the world for years to come. So to me, this is a turning point in Middle Eastern diplomacy. At the same time, I see this as a manifestation of the fact that a new world order is in the making. The unipolar moment is over and the world is moving towards a multipolar system. And the Saudis now have also understood that they cannot put all their eggs in the US basket. Why? Because there is a change in the world and they need to also work with China. At the same time, this is a big development from Iran's point of view because this is a win for regional peace and security. This is a big diplomatic achievement for China, Iran, and Saudi Arabia, but a big loss for Israel and the United States. Israel has been trying to create an alliance against Iran, with the United States leading this campaign from behind, and this deal actually undermines this strategy. The reason it is, I'm hopeful, is going to work is because of China's involvement. Any efforts to undermine this deal will discredit China, and any efforts to implement this deal will give more credibility to right. China and regional peace. So I am cautiously optimistic, and at the same time, I see this as a change in Saudi perception as well. The Saudis initially, thought that they would topple the Houthis in a week. They were not successful. Right. They did not win in Syria. And now this is a new opportunity for Iran and Saudi Arabia to engage and interact, because competition and rivalry has been a key characteristic of Iran-Saudi relations. No cooperation. Now this is an opportunity for both of them to cooperate and have dialogue.
Victor Gao, of course, China brokered this deal. In fact, it's something of a political and diplomatic coup for China. It's part of China's global security initiative. What can you tell us about the deal itself and about this initiative?
Thank you very much for having me. This normalization between the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and Iran is one of the most important and landmark deal in modern history. And China is very much happy and very honored to be part of this deal. And secondly, allow me to emphasize several points. Peace, especially peace between Iran and Saudi Arabia, is not easy. And this is a victory of peace. And let's give a lot of congratulations to the wisdom and courage and vision of both the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia on the one hand and Iran on the other hand for taking very audacious steps forward in the direction of peace. Now, the second point is that this deal is not a one-night stand. I think if Saudi Arabia and Iran can muster and demonstrate courage, wisdom, vision, resourcefulness, for example, and making peace, not only for the normalization of relations, but also moving peace and keep moving in the right direction, then you are talking about a completely different Middle East. You are talking about a completely different Muslim world, for example. And I think this is the most significant point of this deal. That is, let us all work very hard for peace, rather than, for example, keep being boxed in for rivalry and wars and confrontations, etc. And in that sense, I think this is China's contribution. China has very good, excellent relations with Saudi Arabia on the one hand, but China also has very good, strong relations with Iran,
Yeah.
on the other hand. For many years, we basically say we want to have good relations with both of you, and our development of relations with Saudi Arabia should not be done at the expense of our relations with Iran, and vice versa.
Right.
Now China moves one step forward.
Victor, there has been some response, some reaction to this deal. Here's some of what other world leaders are saying. Let's watch.
The leadership role that China is playing on the world stage, a leadership role that is focused on uniting rather than dividing, a leadership role that is focused on forming win-win cooperation and encouraging dispute resolution rather than encouraging perpetual disputes.
I would very much like to say that it is good that Saudi Arabia and Iran want to develop a less conflictual relationship with each other.
So, Victor, there we heard from the Pakistan Foreign Minister as well as the German Chancellor, Olaf Scholz. What does this tell us about Chinese diplomatic heft in the world right now and its particular style in reducing tensions to bring about a peaceful environment in global hotspots?
Absolutely. This is exactly what China stands and is very eager and committed to promoting now. And this rapprochement between Saudi Arabia and Iran is, I think, one of the most successful diplomatic initiatives that China has participated in, even though I think China wants to give all the acknowledgement and recognition to both Iran and Saudi Arabia. But this also reflects that if big countries want to really become warmongers, for example, there will be no peace and stability in the world. But if big countries with global responsibilities really want to commit to promoting peace involving other countries, between relations almost impossible to reconcile, for example.
Yeah.
And we need to acknowledge that both Saudi Arabia and Iran are very proud nations. They have huge civilizations behind it. They have huge influence, for example, throughout the world, not only in the Middle East. And I think what China has been doing is to emphasize again and again the importance of peace, the importance of re-engaging with each other in the normal way, and giving up all the urges or impulses, for example, to resorting to confrontation, conflict, and even war against each other. And this time it worked out. This landmark deal, this means that there will be many other situations that China can play a big role. China has proposed for peaceful diplomacy between Russia and Ukraine. I don't think it's a mission impossible, or the other countries should carefully think about China's proposal. And if there will be a major breakthrough between Russia and Ukraine, hopefully mankind will also again hail for diplomacy for peace.
I want to get to Trita Parsi. Trita, the United States has been the dominant and most influential power in the Middle East, at least from the end of World War II. It's also a very close ally of Saudi Arabia. It's a strategic ally. It's a very close economic ally as well. Now, that seems to be changing. I want to play for you the view of a former U.S. Air Force Lieutenant Colonel, Karen Kwiatkowski. This is what she said. Let's listen.
If Iran and Saudi Arabia are making peace with each other, that is the path forward for many countries. It will be hard for Americans to take that, and they will try to cause it to fail.
So what's your view on how this deal is being seen by the United States?
Well, there certainly is some nervousness in Washington right now. I don't think Washington expected this. They had not seen yet that China had shown serious ambition and capability to pull off the mediation of this kind. Traditionally, China has kept a very low profile, particularly in the Middle East. It has used tremendous discipline to retain very positive relations, not just with Iran and Saudi Arabia, but also with Israel. And one way of maintaining that balance has been to not engage in mediation. Now, when Washington is seeing that China is showing this ambition, and not just in the Middle East, also in Ukraine, there is a bit of nervousness. And I think part of that nervousness is not because stability in the Middle East necessarily would be bad for the U.S. It would actually be quite good for the U.S. as well. But because the United States has positioned itself in such a way that it actually is increasingly entangled and partisan to many conflicts in the region, and as a result cannot play itself a mediating role. So whereas in the past, almost all roads to peace in the Middle East and elsewhere had to go through mediation in Washington, now that seems to be changing. Perhaps many of those roads will go through Beijing. That will be a new world. What that world entails is not certain in any quarter right now. And that's part of the reason why there is nervousness.
Ali Akbar Dareini, as we heard from that former military official here in the United States, there may be some elements here who might want to undermine the deal. In fact, the Washington Post reported that U.S. officials remain uncertain whether the Iranians ultimately will honor the commitment, meaning the whole agreement could fall through. What do you make of that?
This shows that the Americans are unhappy with this deal. They did not expect this, and now they are showing their displeasure. What made this deal possible is China's role as a credible broker of peace in this region. The United States has always supported one Middle Eastern country against the other. It has followed the strategy of buck passing, delegating the responsibility to contain and confront Iran to Saudi Arabia, Israel, and others. Its policy has been to sow discord and initiate wars, but China doesn't follow such a strategy. China has not sided with regional conflicts in this part of the world, while the United States has been doing that. So I see that China is following a balance of interests, and that requires reducing tensions. And this deal serves regional security as well as China's interests. And China is a big importer of oil from this part of the world, and it needs secure energy routes, and this cannot happen without a rapprochement between Tehran and Riyadh, and with American allies like Saudi Arabia coming to the point that they cannot entirely rely on the United States. They see a chance in the new emerging system of multipolarism that they need to work with Asians. And to me, this is an all-Asian, diplomatic and strategic achievement, and the Asian century has begun. But at the same time, let me add this, that the United States wants Iran to be isolated, even as we are talking now, and as the negotiations were being finalized in Beijing, the Israelis and the Americans were conducting joint drills in Nevada, simulating attacks on Iran's nuclear facilities. And to me, probably one of the reasons China stepped in was to reduce tensions and reduce the possibility of a conflict in this region.
Yeah, Trita Parsi, to what extent is this something of a balancing act for Saudi Arabia? On the one hand, wanting to have better relations with Iran, on the other, not distancing itself too much from its ally, the United States?
Well, I think the Saudis have quite understood that we are now in a multipolar world, and as a result, they do need to listen to the Chinese as well. And if the Chinese are pushing for resolving these issues, it would be difficult for the Saudis to say no. But I think a lot of it has also to do with Saudis' calculation vis-a-vis the United States. There is no love lost between MBS and the Biden administration. This is in some ways a slap in the face, yet another slap in the face of Biden from the Saudis. But at the same time, I do think that the Saudis are probably calculating that after normalizing with Iran, they may now have an easier time normalizing with Israel.
Right.
This is not the way Israel would like the normalization to be. The Israelis want Saudi to normalize with Israel and continue to have bad relations with Iran.
Right.
The Saudis may actually play a much more clever game, normalize with Iranians, and then also go forward with the Israelis.
Victor, I've got a little bit of time left. And we look at this deal, which was brokered by China. To what extent was China driving this agreement to make sure that its sources of energy remain stable? It's a very big importer of oil from both Saudi Arabia and from Iran.
Of course, China's relations with Saudi Arabia on the one hand and with Iran on the other hand has always been very important. It also is a very important part of China's energy security strategy. Now, allow me to emphasize one point. Both Saudi Arabia and Iran are members of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. In that case, we should realize that China and the SCO can recruit members which have very bad relations against each other. But within the framework of Shanghai Cooperation Organization, under the same roof, these countries can really sit down in an amicable way, exchange ideas, etc. That probably should be the origin and the beginning of eventually efforts leading to this rapprochement. Now, I again want to give all the spotlight to both Saudi Arabia and Iran on the one hand, but if you ask me a question, what does China get? Now, philosophically, China's interests are maximized if there is peace. And in this case, if peace is made between Saudi Arabia and Iran, China maximizes its own benefit because China wants to promote peace, not only for Saudi Arabia and for Iran, but also peace is the most valuable asset as far as China is concerned. This deal demonstrates China is committed to promoting peace, not only between Saudi Arabia and Iran, and we do believe that peace between these two countries is the best case between these proud, very glorious nations with huge civilizations behind them, and China will continue to promote peace in other parts of the world.
Okay, and that is where we are going to have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C.